The prairie morning was still, save for the distant bawl of a calf and the clank of a windmill pumping water. Sunlight spilled across the ranch yard, gilding the fences and barns in amber light. Inside the ranch house, however, things were less than peaceful. James Holloway, a rancher hardened by years of toil and silence, stood in the kitchen staring at a pan of half-burnt bread. He let out a sigh, raking a hand through his dust-brown hair. Bread-making was not his talent. Ranching was, roping cattle, breaking horses, mending fences. But ever since his wife had passed 3 winters ago, he had tried to shoulder it all, fathering, cooking, keeping the house as well as the land. "Papa!" The small voice tugged his heart more than any burned loaf ever could. He turned to see his 6-year-old daughter Clara, standing barefoot in her nightdress, clutching the hem with one hand and rubbing her eyes with the other. "Morning, Pumpkin," he said softly, bending down to smooth her tangled blonde hair. "You hungry?" Clara peered at the bread, wrinkled her nose, and whispered, "It smells funny." James couldn't help but chuckle. "That's because your papa doesn't know what he's doing in the kitchen." He lifted her into his arms and kissed her forehead. Clara clung to him like she always did. She had been too young to understand fully when her mother passed, but old enough to feel the ache of absence. And James, though strong and capable in the saddle, carried a loneliness heavier than any herd of cattle. That was why, after months of resisting, he had finally put a notice up in town: "Help wanted. Bread baker and cook for Holloway Ranch." By afternoon, the stagecoach rattled up the dirt lane. James stood on the porch, wiping his palms on his trousers. Clara leaned against his leg, shy as ever, peeking from behind his side. The coach door swung open, and down stepped a woman with a plain dress the color of summer wheat. Her bonnet shielded most of her face, but when she lifted her chin, James noticed soft eyes, hazel with flecks of green, the kind of eyes that seemed to see straight through a man's defenses. "Mr. Holloway?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady. "That's me," James answered, tugging his hat brim. "You must be Miss Annie Walker." "Yes, sir." She smoothed her skirt nervously. "I can bake, cook, and keep a kitchen tidy. That was what the notice said you needed." James gave a stiff nod. "That's right. I'll pay you fair wages, room and board included. You'll have Sundays off if you want 'em." Annie glanced down at Clara, who was hiding behind her father's leg. "And this must be your little girl." Clara didn't answer. She just stared at Annie with wide eyes. James cleared his throat. "This here's Clara. She's a bit shy." Annie crouched low, careful not to crowd the child, and smiled warmly. "Well, Clara, I'll be baking bread tomorrow morning. Do you like honey on yours?" Clara's head tilted, curiosity sparking in her eyes. She gave the smallest of nods. Annie winked. "Then honey it shall be." For the first time in weeks, James felt something inside him ease. That evening, the ranch house filled with smells James hadn't known since before his wife's passing. Fresh yeast bread, stew simmering with herbs, and a hint of cinnamon from a pan of baked apples. James sat at the table, watching Annie move about the kitchen with sure hands. She wasn't flashy or overly talkative, she just worked with quiet diligence, humming under her breath now and then. Clara sat close to her, fascinated. She asked questions about everything: why bread rises, why stew bubbles, why apples smell sweet when baked. Annie answered patiently, never once snapping or dismissing her. By the time supper was served, Clara was giggling, and James found himself listening more to the sound of his daughter's laughter than to the clatter of spoons. After the meal, Clara clung to Annie's skirts when it was time to head upstairs. "Miss Annie," she whispered, eyes big as the moon, "will you still be here tomorrow?" Annie bent down, smoothing Clara's hair. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll be here every morning to bake bread. And I'll save the first slice just for you." Clara threw her arms around Annie's neck and hugged tight. Annie froze for a second, surprised, then returned the embrace with gentle arms. James stood in the doorway, his chest tightening. He hadn't expected this. He had hired Annie to bake bread, nothing more. But already, in a single evening, she had brought warmth back into the house, the kind of warmth money couldn't buy. That night, after Clara was asleep, James stepped out onto the porch. The stars were thick overhead, the prairie stretching silent and endless. Annie joined him quietly, her hands folded before her. "You've got a good little girl," she said softly. James nodded, his throat tight. "She's all I got left." Annie looked at him then, her gaze steady but kind. "That's more than enough. She just needs love, Mr. Holloway. And you're giving her that, even if you don't always see it." For a long moment, James couldn't answer. He wasn't used to anyone speaking to him so gently. He wasn't used to feeling seen. And though he told himself Annie was just a hired cook, deep down, something unspoken stirred, a seed of hope, fragile and dangerous. The days that followed seemed to move differently. Where the house had once been quiet and heavy with silence, it now carried the warm rhythm of daily life. Bread baking in the oven, Clara's giggles floating from the kitchen, Annie's soft humming as she worked. James Holloway found himself watching more than he meant to. Annie wasn't the sort of woman who drew attention with boldness. She was steady, gentle, her presence like a balm on a wound that had long refused to heal. Clara blossomed under her care. Each morning she rushed downstairs, hair tangled, eyes bright, eager for Annie's bread and honey. And each night, when Annie read aloud from one of the old books that had sat untouched since James's wife passed, Clara nestled close as though she had known Annie all her life. James told himself it was good for Clara, and that was all. That was reason enough to keep Annie here. But deep down, his own heart stirred in ways he tried hard to ignore. One late afternoon, as the sky blushed with sunset, James saddled a horse to check the north fence. Annie stood by the porch, Clara holding her hand. "You'll be back before dark?" Annie asked, shading her eyes against the light. James nodded. "Shouldn't take long." Clara piped up, "Papa, Miss Annie says she'll bake gingerbread if I help." James managed a smile. "Then you better help her, Pumpkin. I'll be back before supper." As he rode out, he heard Annie laugh softly, her voice mingling with Clara's chatter. It lingered in his ears long after the ranch house was out of sight. But the rancher's resolve was tested sooner than he expected. A week later, Clara caught a fever. It started with sniffles and a cough, but by nightfall her little body burned hot to the touch. James paced the room, his calloused hands trembling as he wrung a cloth and laid it across her forehead. "Easy, sweetheart," he murmured, brushing damp strands of hair from her cheeks. "Papa's here." Annie moved with quiet urgency, brewing tea, cooling water, wiping Clara's brow. When the child whimpered, Annie crooned lullabies in a voice soft as a feather pillow. She never once complained, never once sat down, though exhaustion lined her face. Through the long night, James saw something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for, a woman's tenderness wrapping around his child like a shield. Near dawn, Clara finally slept peacefully, her fever easing. Annie, weary but smiling, stroked the girl's hair once more before stepping out of the room. James followed, closing the door gently behind them. He looked at Annie in the dim hallway, her bonnet gone, hair loose around her shoulders, face pale from worry but still composed. "You didn't have to stay up all night," he said quietly. Annie met his gaze. "Of course I did. She needed someone. She needed both of us." Her words cut straight through him. The next morning, when the fever had broken and Clara was resting, James went out to the barn, his thoughts heavy. He leaned against a post, staring at the dust motes floating in the golden light. He had hired Annie to bake bread. That was all. But she had given more than bread, more than meals. She had given his daughter the kind of love he feared she might never know again. and she had given him hope he had buried 3 winters ago. James drew in a breath, then strode back to the house. Annie was at the table, kneading dough with steady hands. She looked up, a streak of flour on her cheek. "Clara's still sleeping," she said softly. James nodded. Then, before his courage could falter, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. It had sat in his drawer for years, untouched, the last gift he had ever meant to give his late wife before she passed. A simple gold band, nothing fancy, but forged with sincerity. Annie's eyes widened as James set the pouch on the table between them. "Miss Annie," he began, his voice rough, "I know I hired you to bake bread. But what you've given me, what you've given Clara, it's more than I ever expected. You've put laughter back in my girl's heart. You've put warmth back in this house." Annie's hands stilled on the dough, her breath caught. "I don't want to pay you wages any more," James said, his throat tight. "I want to give you a home, a family. I want you to stay as my wife." Silence hung for a heartbeat, broken only by the tick of the clock and the low crackle of the fire. Then Annie's eyes filled with tears. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling, "are you sure?" He stepped closer, covering her flour-dusted hands with his own. "I've never been more sure of anything." At that moment, Clara padded into the room, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She saw the ring glinting on the table and blinked. "Papa," she asked curiously, "are you giving Miss Annie a present?" James bent down and scooped her into his arms. "Not just a present, Pumpkin. I'm asking her to be part of our family." Clara's face lit up, brighter than any sunrise. She turned to Annie. "Does that mean you'll be my mama?" Annie pressed a hand over her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. She nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. If your papa truly wants it, then yes." Clara squealed and hugged her tight. James slipped the ring onto Annie's finger, his heart pounding but lighter than it had been in years. For the first time since loss had hollowed him, James Holloway felt whole again. That evening, the ranch house was filled with the smell of warm bread and ginger, laughter echoing through the walls. Outside, the prairie wind whispered across the land, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. And in the kitchen, beneath the glow of lamplight, a rancher, his daughter, and the woman who had baked more than bread shared their first meal as a family.